Thank you for honoring our invitation. So we are starting right away. I'd like to seize this opportunity to invite the head of Classics Department, Professor E.F. Tayo. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. It is our pleasure to welcome you to this very auspicious occasion. The Department of Classics, just as you all know, we are the classics in Ibadan. And in a series of the kind of things we do best, we have invited an eminent professor from Princeton University in the USA, the person of Professor Hendrik Lorenz. Professor Lorenz will be taking us through the philosophy of Aristotle as it applies to Africans. And so it is my pleasure to welcome you once again. And I want to solicit your attention as we listen to the lecture.
Thank you. And before we call Hendrik to deliver his paper, I'd like to say something quickly about our program. Hendrik and I belong to a wider body of classicists worldwide where we discuss classics in Africa. So it is called Classics Beyond Borders. It's from the University of Princeton in the United States. But I'd like to say that briefly about the importance of promoting classical studies in Nigeria, particularly, and in Africa generally. So classical studies in Nigeria has had a profound impact on our country's educational landscape and cultural heritage. Classical studies, encompassing the languages, literature, history, and culture of ancient civilizations of Greece and Rome, offer a wealth of knowledge and insights that can enrich our minds and lives as Africans. So by studying classics, we gain a deeper understanding of the foundations of Western civilization, which have had a profound impact on modern societies. Classical studies can also foster critical thinking, analytical skills, and effective communication, which are essential tools for personal and professional development. Moreover, classical studies provide a unique perspective on universal themes and human experiences, allowing us to engage with the world in a more nuanced and informed way. The study of classical languages, such as Latin and ancient Greek, can also enhance language skills and open doors to a vast array of literary and historical texts. From some of those texts, the distinguished Professor Emeritus Professor Femi Oshofison has adapted 3 classical texts: Medallier from Medea, Tegoni from Antigone, and Women of Owu from the Trojan Women. So classics has had some impact on our older professors. So here in Nigeria, cultural heritage and identity are deeply valued. Classical studies have been complementing and enriching our existing various cultural traditions. By exploring the classical world, we have gained a broader understanding of the global cultural landscape and developed a more informed sense of our place within it. Promoting classical studies in Africa also have practical benefits. Our discipline has enhanced educational standards, fosters cultural exchange. That's why Hendrik is there now, the cultural exchange thing, and provide opportunities for collaboration and innovation, both at home and abroad. By embracing classical studies, we can tap into a rich intellectual tradition that has shaped the world and continue to inspire and educate future generations. So I implore us to continue to work together to promote classical studies in Nigeria, nay Africa, to unlock the potential of our youth and to further enrich our cultural heritage. By doing so, we can build a brighter future for ourselves, our communities, and our continent. Thank you. So now, I'm going to read the citation briefly here. Please stand. Hendrik Lorenz Department of Philosophy, Princeton University. Current academic employment: Professor, Department of Philosophy, Princeton University, 2012. Associate Professor, Department of Philosophy, 2007 to 2012. Assistant Professor, Department of Philosophy, Princeton University, 2001 to 2007. His education: D.Phil, Philosophy, University of Oxford, October 2000. Areas of specialization: Ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, Medieval philosophy, Latin American philosophy. Honors and awards: Berman Fellow in the Humanities, Council of the Humanities, Princeton University. Robert K. Root University, Preceptorship, Princeton. He has over 100 publications. I can't begin to read them all. So he's going to talk to us today on the topic of Aristotle and Aristotelian in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Olasope, and thank you, Professor Taiwo, for the welcome. I'm so pleased to be here. I'm going to talk about Africa in Aristotle and the Aristotelian tradition. This brings to bear my expertise in ancient Greek and Roman philosophy and science, and also in medieval philosophy and science. And I'd like to add one thing to what Professor Olasope was saying so eloquently about the classics and reasons for studying the classics. We are studying the Greek and Roman classics, the foundations of philosophy, of science, of theater, and of so many other undertakings. And many of the ideas that are part of the Greco-Roman tradition are extremely positive and helpful and uplifting, but not all of them are. There are also harmful ideas in the philosophy and in the science of the Greeks and Romans, and many of these harmful ideas got amplified later in the medieval tradition and in the modern philosophical and scientific tradition. And one of the most harmful ideas that comes out of this tradition is racism. European racism in particular against Black Africans. And I, in the paper that I'm about to present, will present to some extent a reconstruction of the philosophical and scientific roots of European racism towards Black Africans. That's still a source of ongoing prejudices and ongoing discrimination from Europeans and Americans towards Africans, and we need to dismantle it. But in order to dismantle it, we need to understand how it works. And so one of the contributions that I hope to make is to give you at least some sense of how in the ancient and medieval tradition the tools were put together, the framework was put together that justifies and naturalizes prejudices and discrimination against Black Africans. And I think it's important. It is somewhat depressing to read some of these texts, and I want to sort of give you a heads up that some of the texts that I'm about to discuss are among the most depressing and demoralizing texts that one can read in philosophy. But it's, I think, important nevertheless to study these texts because they continue to inform the present. It's not only positive ways in which philosophy and science informs the present, there are some very negative ones as well. On the bright side, I'm going to talk about a geographical theory that emerges in the medieval period, according to which actually the geographical conditions where we are, near the equator, are paradise-like. So not all of the ideas in this tradition about Africa are negative, although there are some ideas that are very negative. And one thing that I'm going to emphasize is how in the conception of Africa that emerges in the Aristotelian tradition, Africa is a place of extremes. There is the very best, the Europeans of this period think, to be found in Africa, earthly paradise and paradise-like conditions, and people who are suitable inhabitants of paradise-like conditions, but there's also, this tradition thinks, the worst that one can find. In geography, but then also in human society and culture, to be found in that same zone, which they refer to as the tropical zone. So that's a preview of what I'm about to say. I will more or less read the paper because I want to finish in about half an hour or so that we have time for questions and discussion. I also want to point out, I don't know whether everyone can see this, I put my telephone number on the whiteboard over there, and you can use that to connect with me on WhatsApp. In particular, if you have academic questions about how to navigate the academic system in the US, if you look at, for example, Princeton philosophy or Harvard philosophy or classic websites, and you see information about how to apply, but you have questions about that, please be in touch. I'd be happy to talk. And you can easily reach me on WhatsApp. In the paper that I'm about to read, I am previewing a larger project. I will discuss a conception of Africa that gradually emerges in the Aristotelian tradition, beginning with Aristotle himself. I want to clarify that in talking about Africa, I really have in mind sub-Saharan Africa. I will discuss the part of Africa that lies between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, as it appears in Aristotle and the Aristotelian tradition. It turns out that these Aristotelian thinkers had a large impact on the European scientific conception of that part of Africa. And that scientific conception, which emerges in the medieval period, then in turn has an impact on the expectations and opinions of Europeans as they first arrived in West Africa in the 15th century. To begin with, these are Portuguese explorers, tradespeople, but also slave raiders and human traffickers. So I begin with Aristotle himself. Then I turn to the later geographers Strabo and Ptolemy. I put the names of the main players in my story on the whiteboard over there, together with dates about when they lived, just to give you some orientation about who the people are and what the historical periods are that I'm talking about. And then I turn to my main topic, which is the geographical and ethnographic theory of tropical Africa that was put forward by the medieval Aristotelian Albert the Great. And that shows the influence of the Persian Aristotelian Ibn Sina. And lastly, I talk briefly about some ways in which Aristotelian science influenced the thoughts and actions of Portuguese explorers in the 15th century, as those thoughts and actions are described in an historical account of the Portuguese conquest of Guinea. This is the European way of talking about West Africa, by the 15th century Portuguese chronicler Gomes Eanes de Zurara. This is a lot of ground to cover, and I apologize for covering this ground very quickly. Some of the text that I look at, I won't have much time for, but I want to give you an overview, and I want to call attention to some of the texts that I think are interesting and worth studying. So Aristotle claims that the entire region between the tropics is uninhabitable because of excessive heat. He thinks that as you travel south from the Mediterranean, places become hotter and hotter as the sun shines on them more directly at angles approaching 90 degrees at noon. That's a very important idea in the European geographical tradition, the idea of sun rays hitting the Earth at an angle of 90 degrees. This happens in the tropical zone, but it doesn't happen outside of the tropical zone. In Europe it never happens, because the most direct sunlight that Europeans get, for example Greeks get, that happens at the time of the solstice, which is in June, around June 20th. That is the most direct sunlight that Greeks get, and even then it's not 90 degrees, it's at a more oblique angle. So they theorized a lot about what happens if the sun rays hit the Earth at this angle of 90 degrees. And that happens in every place in the tropics at certain points in the year. So here we are close to the equator, and so it happens here at about the time of the equinoxes in March and September. I think you probably don't have much of a sense of when this happens, but to me, as a European, it's very significant. So this is when, at noon, you don't see any shadows, right? Sort of a pole erected straight will not cast a shadow, right? Because the sun at noon is directly overhead. I would be interested in hearing more from you about whether people here are sensitive to this, whether you notice it, you pay attention to it. I always am very amazed when I see it, because in the north we never see this. Aristotle attaches special importance to the disappearance of the shadow. That is how it's put. The disappearance of the shadow. Right? The idea is when the sun is directly overhead, objects do not cast shadows. What he has in mind is that in some regions there are days when at noon the sun reaches the zenith. That's a technical term for being directly overhead. It's from the Arabic. So that vertical objects do not cast shadows. It's in this sense that then and there the shadow disappears. In any place along the Tropic of Cancer, for example, this happens at the time of the summer solstice, so this is around June the 20th. We are at latitude 7 degrees north right here, so here the shadow will disappear at some point in early April, and then again at some point in October. So this must have happened fairly recently, in early April. So here's a text from Aristotle that talks about this, and it talks in particular about this unfavorable, this negative view concerning the whole tropical region. It's item 1 on the handout if you have a look at the handout. There are 2 habitable sections of the earth, Aristotle says. One near our upper or northern pole, the other near the southern pole. And their shape is like that of a drum. If you draw lines from the center of the earth, they cut out a drum-shaped figure. The lines from 2 cones, the base of the one is the tropic, of the other the ever-visible circle, their vertex is at the center of the earth. 2 other cones towards the south pole give corresponding segments of the earth. These sections alone are habitable. I want to just briefly call attention to the picture. I apologize that not everyone will be able to see this equally well. What happened to the slide on the screen? Could we have that back while I'm talking? So this is a representation of the Earth. Here's the equator. And these are the 2 tropics. This is the Tropic of Cancer, this is the Tropic of Capricorn. And Aristotle thinks that this whole region of the Earth, all the way between the 2 tropics, is uninhabitable because it's excessively hot. Whereas he thinks that the region which includes all of the Mediterranean Sea and extends into northern Europe, between the Tropic of Cancer and the Arctic Circle is of temperate quality and so is habitable for human beings. Aristotle also thinks that in the southern hemisphere there is a corresponding temperate region which is habitable for human beings. This would be between the Tropic of Capricorn, which runs through the capital of Namibia, Windhoek, then all the way to the Antarctic Circle. So for example, he would think that much of South Africa is in a temperate region where human beings can live, right? So this is a very strong claim, and I want to just call attention to the strength of the claim. He thinks that the whole region in between the 2 tropics, so including, of course, where we are right now, is such that human beings cannot survive in that region because it's too hot. So that is what Europeans, what Greeks, Romans thought in the classical period. This, of course, given what we've said, what both Professor Olasope and I have said about the enormous influence and power of the Greek and Roman tradition on subsequent European developments and also developments in other cultures and other countries, it's important to note this. For centuries, the most highly educated people in Europe around the Mediterranean world lived under the mistaken assumption that in the whole tropical area, no human beings lived and could possibly live, right? So they also thought if you travel too far south, the conditions would get so hostile to human existence that you would first get very sick and then die. So it's just important to keep that in mind as background to what happens later. Later on, scientists operating within the Aristotelian tradition became more and more well-informed about the facts and then updated their theoretical framework in light of that better information. And to some extent I will trace that development in the next few pages of my paper. Aristotle also thinks, and here comes another really important idea that I need to emphasize, he also thinks that the climate of a place correlates with the psychological and cognitive features of the people who live in that place. So there's a particularly clear passage about the relationship between different climates and features of human populations, which is book 7, chapter 7 of Aristotle's Politics. I put the text on your handout as item 2. I won't read that out because it would take us too long. But the idea basically is this, Aristotle thinks. Thank you. Here we have this representation. So sorry, this is in Spanish. I'm working with a number of collaborators in Spain on a translation, and Colombia, on a translation of a medieval text from Albert the Great. And so this is part of the illustrations we have prepared. So Aristotle thinks that the orange and green areas are the temperate areas where people can live and live well. He thinks that to the north, where we have the blue color, it's too cold for human beings to live or live well. And in the red area, it's altogether too hot for human beings to live. So then he also thinks that right in the middle of the green area, that's roughly where Athens is, where Aristotle lived. And so he thinks, and this is a pattern in the scientific tradition, the scientists who work tend to think wherever it is that they were born, or that they lived, or that they worked, that's the very best climate. And they also then thought that that is the climate which best supports human life, and which then also typically tends to generate and foster human beings with the best intellectual and moral qualities. And so in Aristotle we get a version of this. The idea is that Greeks have the best moral characteristics and the best intellectual characteristics, as he puts it in the text that's on your handout. They are intelligent and they are courageous. They have a good mix of intelligence and courage. Whereas Aristotle thinks if you go further north and it gets colder, people lose their intelligence. So he thinks that Northern Europeans like myself, people who are born and live in cold climates such as Germany, for example. Germany was on the sort of geographical map of Aristotle and other ancient Greeks. He thinks that people who live in that region and in that climate, they retain courage, but they lose intelligence. So they're unintelligent, but courageous, he thinks. And that is, he thinks, driven by the climate in which they live. And he has an elaborate theory that is trying to explain that. And likewise, if you go further south, it gets hotter. And then the idea is people keep their intelligence, but they lose their courage. So they become timid while still being intelligent. That's the picture in Aristotle Politics 7:7. This idea remains influential throughout the next centuries, in fact into the 19th century. This idea that climate determines human characteristics and that human diversity can be explained by reference to diversity of climate is enormously influential, and I think it's still not completely out of the picture, out of the window. It should be, but it's not. It's no longer, I think, sort of prominent as a scientific idea these days, but it's still prominent in sort of prejudices, patterns of discrimination, and so on. Even ideas such as tropical diseases, which get stigmatized as sort of particularly virulent, particularly dangerous. Many of the diseases that are called tropical also occur outside of the tropics in the northern hemisphere, but still the idea that there are some particularly dangerous and harmful diseases that are tropical, that I think is part of the pattern of discrimination and prejudice that I'm talking about. Okay. Now I turn to Strabo and Ptolemy. We've seen that Aristotle thinks that the whole tropical region is uninhabited and uninhabitable by human beings. And for Africa, this means that the region south of the Tropic of Cancer is uninhabitable, setting aside the relatively small part of Africa that lies south of the Tropic of Capricorn, and that is irrelevant from the point of view of the Greeks because they had no knowledge of southern Africa. This, of course, means that almost all of sub-Saharan Africa is uninhabitable according to Aristotle's picture, including, for example, all of Nigeria in the west, and also all of Kenya and Tanzania in the east. Aristotle's claims about the tropical zone are known to be false already in the 1st century BC. So already 300 years after Aristotle's lifetime, people knew that, in fact, people live in the tropical zone and live well and pleasantly. So one important philosopher and scientist who updates the ancient scientific picture is Posidonius. I put his name there on the whiteboard. And he was born 135 before the birth of Christ. He objects to Aristotle by saying that the habitable world extends well into the tropical zone, and that the cities of Syene, this is modern Aswan in southern Egypt, and Meroe, now in Sudan, lie in that tropical zone, with Syene lying at the Tropic of Cancer, Meroe lying 5,000 stadia further south. So this is at about the 10th parallel north, which also runs through Nigeria in the west and Somalia in the east of Africa. Our main source for the geographical views of Posidonius is Strabo, born 64 before Christ. He's also on the whiteboard there, who reports having traveled south of Syene in the entourage of Aelius Gallus, who was the Roman prefect of Egypt. Strabo is clearly aware that Syene lies at the Tropic of Cancer, and so also he's clearly aware that he traveled inside the tropical zone. He actually reports an experience that he himself saw about the disappearing shadow at noon. By the 2nd century of the Common Era after the birth of Christ, Ptolemy, so he was born around 100, reports more information about sub-Saharan Africa and the climates of the tropical zone. He locates the Avalite Gulf near the 8th parallel north. Avalites was a trading post on the East African coast in present-day Somalia. This is the southernmost landmark in Africa mentioned in Ptolemy's Almagest. Outside of Africa, Ptolemy mentions Taprobane, which is present-day Sri Lanka, which he locates near the 4th parallel north, so very close to the equator. Apart from these reports, Ptolemy also mentions an idea that probably goes back to Posidonius, namely that the regions beneath the celestial equator could be inhabited, since the climate must be quite temperate. So this is in a text that's on the handout, handout item 3. For the sun does not stay long in the neighborhood of the zenith. That's to say, if you're at the equator or near the equator, then the idea is that there aren't a lot of successive days when the sun is directly overhead at noon. The sun in its annual path across the ecliptic moves rather rapidly over the equator, but then spends a fair amount of time turning at the tropics during the solstices, and that generates a long period of intense heat, right, around the time of the solstices. So in the northern hemisphere, that's around June 20th. So if you are close to the Tropic of Cancer, then sort of for 6 weeks around June 20th, the days are extremely hot because of the direct insolation, the rectilinear rays of the sun. So he says, Ptolemy, its motion in declination is swift, the motion of the sun, around the equinoctial points, and hence the summer would be temperate. Furthermore, it's not very far from the zenith at the solstices, so the winter would not be harsh. For what these inhabited regions are, we have no reliable grounds for saying, for up to now they are unexplored by men from our part of the inhabited world, and what people say about them must be considered guesswork rather than a report. So Ptolemy is calling attention to a theoretical possibility of very temperate climate conditions right at the equator, as opposed to the harsh and extremely hot conditions under the tropic, but he also notes that he has no information whatsoever about people, cultures, and civilizations at the equator. However, what he says makes his readers expect that there probably are going to be such civilizations. Okay, we now, and also I should say this, Ptolemy, right, who worked in the 2nd century AD, is the most advanced, best informed geographer of the ancient Greco-Roman tradition. So this is sort of the pinnacle, this is the best informed picture of Africa that the ancient Greeks and Romans developed. And obviously it has its limitations, but also gets a number of things right. So in particular, Aristotle's mistake about the complete uninhabitability of the whole tropical zone by now is completely corrected. Okay, so now I turn to the medieval period. We can translated into Latin and served as guides to the interpretation of Aristotle. In the mid-13th century, Albertus, or Albert, I call him Albert the Great, but he's also known as Albertus Magnus, that's just a Latin version of his name. He produced a comprehensive body of commentaries and some original philosophical works that were meant to make Aristotle's, but also Ptolemy's contributions to philosophy and science accessible and available to the Latin-speaking Europeans in Western Europe. And one of Albertus's original work is De Natura Loci, on the nature of place, in which he offers a general theory of place, a geographical theory, and an ethnographic theory, a theory of human diversity. And he takes human diversity to be caused, determined, and maintained by the diversity of climates. He has a very explicit theoretical framework that's meant to make that intelligible. According to Albertus, much of the tropical zone is habitable, so he follows Ptolemy in this. Furthermore, he follows Ptolemy in thinking that the region around the equator is temperate, because, as was already pointed out by Posidonius, the sun on its annual course along the ecliptic passes quickly over regions that lie near the equator, and, Albert adds, because a period of about 4 months passes between one approach of the sun to such regions and the next approach. He holds that as a result, such regions, or regions near the equator, are not excessively heated by the perpendicular 90 degrees rays of the sun at the time of the 2 annual equinoxes, and moreover, after each period of heat caused by the sun approaching, there are relatively short periods of cold that are caused by the sun receding. And he adds considerations in favor of thinking that the region around the equator is not only habitable, not only a place where human beings can live, but in fact supremely productive, fertile, and generative. So this sort of initiates ideas about the earthly paradise being found in that region. On the other hand, Albert's geographical theory presents the regions under the tropics themselves as extremely hot and as not continuously habitable. He thinks that the region under the Tropic of Capricorn is even hotter than that under the Tropic of Cancer, because he follows Ptolemy in thinking that the ecliptic is not concentric with the Earth, in such a way that the sun on its annual path is closest to the Earth when it reaches the Tropic of Capricorn, and so renders regions near that tropic extraordinarily hot. And it's not, of course, a geographical coincidence that the 2 large African deserts are under the 2 tropics, right? The Sahara Desert under the Tropic of Cancer and the Namib Desert under the Tropic of Capricorn. The fact about the Sahara Desert and its correlation with the Tropic of Cancer was, of course, known to these theorists and was treated as an important data point for constructing their theories. Albert also maintains the Aristotelian idea that climate correlates with human psychology, and moreover that well-blended temperate human beings are going to be found in well-blended temperate climates. While humans who live in extreme climates show various types he thinks of psychological and cognitive defects, right? The sort of picture that we saw in Aristotle, he takes over, but he has a more nuanced geographical theory than Aristotle has. Albertus is not only a philosopher in the Aristotelian tradition, he's also a theologian, and he conceives of philosophy and theology as 2 distinct enterprises. Nevertheless, he thinks of them as interrelated. In particular, he thinks that philosophical and scientific arguments are available for use in discussing theological questions. One fascinating example of this is Albert's discussion of the question where the earthly paradise is located. He argues that the location of the earthly paradise is near the equator, and in fact that it lies at the source of the Nile, which he correctly locates to the south of Ethiopia near the equator. In arguing for this view, Albert cites the opinion of Ibn Sina that the region at the equator is best and most suited for habitation, and as in On the Nature of Place, he argues that places at the equator are temperate because the sun passes quickly over them. Remarkably, he adds that places that lie outside of the tropics receive rays of the sun that are not temperately hot, but are defective in that they incline towards coldness. So this is remarkable because he's now privileging the tropical zone as being one where the rays of the sun are not defective, not too weak, but have the ideal kind of strength. So this amounts to a privileging of the tropical zone, especially near the area of the equator. So he thinks, based on these arguments, that the earthly paradise lies at the equator, and to this he adds arguments for thinking that paradise lies at the source of the Nile, and so in East Africa. According to scripture, Albertus claims, the Nile issues from paradise, and he then argues as follows, and this important text is text 4 on the handout. And it's known that the Nile flows from Ethiopia into Egypt, and Ethiopia lies towards the equator, given that it lies under the Tropic of Cancer. Therefore, the Nile flows from the equator or nearby. Furthermore, it's a sign of this that the Nile is said to flood twice a year. And those who came from that land report that it floods when the sun is in Cancer and when it is in Capricorn. And when the sun is in those tropics, it is winter for those who live under the equator, and it's their winter based on the withdrawal of the sun for just 3 celestial signs. Therefore, the sun raises vapors and does not consume them along that line, along the equator. Therefore, rains fall then and there. Therefore, since the Nile always floods at those times, it receives an increase of water from the rains that fall under the equatorial line, and this could not be unless it passed through that line. Therefore, you see the rigorous philosophical or scientific argumentation happening there, all these therefore, that's a sign of argumentation happening, and he's claiming the full authority of reason and of argument for the conclusions that he's deriving. So the conclusion is that the Nile flows from the equator and from paradise, as scripture says. Therefore, it is seen that paradise is there, in East Africa near the source of the Nile. So the passage illustrates how Albertus uses geographical information or misinformation. Some of this is fake information, some of it is real. And also how he uses rigorous argumentation in seeking to establish the location of the earthly paradise. That the Nile floods in the Mediterranean summer months between June and September had long puzzled Greco-Roman theorists, because in the Mediterranean, those months are dry, right? The summer months, June to September in the Mediterranean are dry months, and they think it's extremely strange when they come to Egypt, and they're very well familiar with Egypt, that there, this enormous river, the Nile, floods during those months, so that for them, dry months, June to September, are actually very wet somewhere, namely wherever the Nile comes from, right? And then that generates the kind of theoretical framework that we've just been through. However, in the Greco-Roman tradition, the river typically is held to flood once. So the Greeks and Romans think that the Nile floods only once a year for a period of about 2 months or so. So, whereas Albert here tells us that the Nile floods twice a year. He refers to sources that report 2 floodings of the Nile at the time of the solstices. So that would be around June 20th, and then again December. It's striking that the same idea of 2 floodings of the Nile per year is present in 15th century chronicler Gomez Ames de Zurara, to whom I return shortly. I suspect that that idea comes from Arabic sources, that's to say the 2 floodings of the Nile per year. Now, if you look at the actual scientific facts, it's very difficult to ascertain this, because how do you differentiate between one flood which sort of reaches a peak, then goes down a bit, then reaches another peak? You could think of that as 1 flood per year. But if you think of the sort of peaks as typically forming a pattern where there are these 2 distinct peaks per year, then you could treat sort of a single 3-month flooding as 2 episodes of peak flooding, and then you could get 2 annual ones. There's also certainly the possibility of historical variation in the pattern of flooding. So when the 10th, 12th century Arabs report that there are 2 floodings of the Nile, that might not be misinformation, that might be information that was reasonably accurate for their time. given their interpretations. But in any case, we find in Albert the idea of 2 annual floodings of the Nile, and that plays an important role, right, in his argument for the conclusion that the earthly paradise is found at the source of the Nile. It's an intriguing fact, so fun fact, in the southern part of Uganda, which lies at the equator and which in fact is the location of the source of the Nile. So the Nile springs out of Lake Victoria in the south of Uganda. So fun fact, Uganda there actually has 2 annual rainy seasons, one in March to May and another one in September to December. So it actually to some extent matches the report that we find in the Arabic tradition, and that's reflected in Albert. In any case, Albert is clearly thinking of the region along the equator as privileged, in that it has a temperate climate, a perfect optimal climate, and that it's exceptionally fertile and generative. In this he follows not only the speculative thoughts of Greek thinkers such as Ptolemy, but also the better informed views of Ibn Sina, who himself was an avid traveler, and who also had access to a good deal of geographical information that goes beyond what the ancient Greeks knew. Ibn Sina held that the equatorial region was the most temperate region of the world, and in his medical work, The Canon of Medicine, he claimed that the people with the most temperate constitution are found in the region near the equator. But Albertus also thinks that the tropical zone, and tropical Africa in particular, includes regions that are excessively hot and at best marginally habitable. Albert is quite explicit that the correlation that he envisages between climate and human constitution has a causal basis, that people are the way they are, he thinks, because of the climate in which they live. And he thinks that the place in which a living thing is born is like a father to the human being born in that place, in that it, the place where the person is born, gives form and being to the person. On this view, biological reproduction and nutrition are just parts of the complex mechanism by which places transmit form and being, characteristics, to the things and beings and people who are in places. And so he thinks that one can explain all kinds of features of diverse human populations by reference to the places in which they live and the climates that prevail in those places. In this way, the concepts of temperate and intemperate, or excessive climates, are strongly normative notions. Notions that have moral and even political significance. Albertus echoes Aristotle's views that inhabitants of the Mediterranean region have a temperate constitution that makes them apt for intelligence and virtue, and that Northern Europeans, such as himself, he was actually German, have a defective constitution that makes them unintelligent, but vigorous and energetic. However, when it comes to inhabitants of hot or warm climates, to the south of the Mediterranean, Albertus innovates significantly over Aristotle. As is to be expected, he thinks that there is a differentiation of tropical inhabitants that reflects the differentiation of tropical climates. He describes the inhabitants of regions of the Tropic of Cancer as having black skin and curly hair and hearts that are cold and timid. He then draws a sharp contrast between those who live near the Tropic of Cancer and those who live near the equator, and that's text 5. Perhaps the most important, but also the most difficult and, I'm afraid, depressing text to read. It's sort of distillation of medieval European racism towards black Africans. So he says, and in psychic operations, those who live under the equator are vigorous because of the fineness of their pneuma, so there's some scientific detail that I can't discuss now, and they are even more vigorous in intellectual discovery. There's a sign of this in that people outstanding in philosophy have existed in India, so from the equatorial region. He thinks there are tremendous philosophers found in equatorial regions, and especially in the mathematical and magical arts, because of the strength of the stars over those climates, over which the planets project their rays perpendicularly. Nonetheless, this is the first climate under the equator, so the idea is, right, that the climate at the equator is perfect, and there are perfect human beings there, wonderful philosophers and scientists, but under the Tropic of Cancer, things are very different. He says, because of the excess of heat there, because of the excess of heat there, the blackest Ethiopians are slight of body and foolish of mind. So the ideas unintelligent. And this is so because of the deficiency and evaporation of their psychic humor. So while he thinks that people who live near the equator are outstandingly intelligent, he thinks that the Ethiopians, and this just means black Africans living sort of around the Tropic of Cancer in the language of this time, are not only timid but also unintelligent. This is by far the most negative description of any group of people in Albertus's ethnographic theory, which reflects the fact that Albertus also thinks that the regions along the two tropics are only marginally inhabitable. We may conclude that Albertus constructs the tropical zone and tropical human populations as exhibiting a certain bipolarity. Within the inhabited world, as Albert sees it, the very worst climates and the very best climates are found within tropical Africa. And likewise, he thinks, some of the populations inhabiting the tropical zone have the least desirable psychological and cognitive features, according to his theory, whereas other tropical populations, populations near the equator, have some of the most desirable features. Thank you so much. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Professor Lorenz. And we're going to take questions now. We don't have time. Please, if you have questions, can you please signify by raising up your hands? That was a very interesting lecture.
No, not so much a question. Just to, could you give us an idea of the sources of information for this video? They didn't just imagine. So there must have been some contact with people who've been around there. Especially why they think that beyond the equator is a reflection of the south, is reverse south of what happened in the north. Where did their information come from?
Do you want to take one question or you take seven questions?
One question. I'll be quick. Let's take it. Otherwise I will not remember. So I'll briefly repeat the question. What are the main sources that these theories are built on, right? The ancient and medieval ones, but also, in particular, what might be the source for the claims that they're making about the southern hemisphere, and in particular southern Africa, right, as being temperate or moderate? That's already in Aristotle, so that's 2,500 years ago in the European scientific tradition that was already stated. What made them think this, right? So it's very clear that Aristotle never talked to anyone who crossed the equator, never crossed any European who crossed the equator, so he had no knowledge about the southern half of Africa. He is speculating that what the basis of the speculation is ideas about the rays of the angles of the rays of the sun. So he thinks that he has worked out a theory, right, which explains to him why in the northern hemisphere there's a temperate region between the cold region and the hot region in the northern hemisphere. And he realizes that given the astronomical facts that he has access to, the same kind of differentiation of angles of the rays of the sun throughout the year is found everywhere in the southern hemisphere. And so he projects that the southern hemisphere is going to have exactly the same kind of differentiation as the northern hemisphere. And so he knows that of course he doesn't know that there is land in the southern part of Africa, he doesn't have information about that, but he thinks that if there is land to the south of the equator in Africa, then some of it is going to be temperate because it'll be a mirror image of the conditions in the northern hemisphere. So that's so far as Aristotle is concerned. When we come to the later thinkers, so Posidonius, Strabo, Ptolemy, they have a wealth of information that they get through trade activities, but also to some extent military activities. So we have evidence that the Romans were already going as far south as the island of Zanzibar along the East African coast. So they had already entered the tropical zone for sure. And in fact got very close to the equator. And then the Arabs, of course, in the context of Islamization and also trade, definitely explored even the southern half of the African continent quite early, already in the 8th or 9th centuries, and that is reflected in the Arabic texts. And Albert now has access to all of this information that comes out of the Arabic tradition. So this is already a quite well-informed geographical theory.
Thank you. Please let me start with a confession. My discipline is very far from classics. But my discipline, which is agriculture, is opposed to all what we have had. We believe that the tropics is before a human being can survive, he has to have food. And we know that the tropics has the most diverse agricultural productivity in the world. So to say that we believe that people live more in the tropics than in the Arctic, like Greenland, where Trump wants to take over now. So we believe that the tropics, which support human beings, is more populated than Arctic. Then when we look at the angle of the ray of light, we know that if the ray of light is very perpendicular, it increases photosynthesis, which is the basis of life. So this is why I say that what I'm hearing now is different from what I was taught in agriculture. And then I mean, we're going to a different difficult line now. In anthropology, human beings originated from the tropics, if I remember very well. So why is it that where somebody originated is not regarded as very mispopulated? I don't know whether I've made sense, but this is from, I'm talking from the position of a farmer. Thank you.
Let me first of all apologize for coming late. I have no option than to come in when I came. Now, I am from philosophy and political science. And one of the things that we cherish about Aristotle is the focus on experience. He was very detailed in terms of his observations and all of that. But Aristotle is also surprisingly affected by common prejudices of the time. For instance, Aristotle thinking that men have more teeth than women. To what extent is Aristotle's idea about Africa influenced by the prevailing prejudices of his time?
Thank you so much. Thank you for both of the interventions about the agricultural perspective and the perspective, basically the modern scientific perspective, right, that you sketch about perpendicular sun rays being in fact very generative because they best support photosynthesis. This of course is true. In Aristotle, this may be a prejudice, right, that Aristotle has. I think this is just a prejudice, the idea being that perpendicular sun rays would be destructive. One can see how he arrives at this prejudice, right? So if you are in Greece, the summer period is a period where nothing grows because there's no rain. It's extremely dry and extremely hot and things are destroyed. Many plants are destroyed, and then the winter and spring is a period of rejuvenation because there's rain, right? And so from a Greek point of view, and this just shows the positionality of everything, right? So if you are in Greece, it's very natural to think that the sun rays, as they become more and more vertical, become more and more destructive. That's an artifact of the conditions in Greece, where the summertime, right, when the sun rays are most vertical, they never become completely vertical. But that's the driest period, which is a period of destruction of crops and other plants. Whereas the winter, when the sun rays are least vertical, that's a wet period, and so it's a fertile and productive period. So it's a prejudice, but one can understand why the prejudice arose. Now, in the text that I called attention to, the medieval period, they actually started to realize that perpendicular sun rays are not necessarily a bad thing. So in Ibn Sina, in the Arabic tradition, and although, again, this reflects better understanding and better information, right? So Arabs actually had traveled equatorial regions, they had become comfortable and familiar with perpendicular sun rays, and they had even realized that actually they are positive, generative. They generate fertile conditions. And so that's already in place right in the 13th century in the Aristotelian tradition, but very much not so in the original Aristotle. So there's, I think, a really interesting historical development of making progress in light of better information, and the progress defeats the prejudices that come from a certain positionality. I think I addressed both questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If you have any questions online, yes, you can direct the question to Professor Olakunle. Okay, she has one here. Just say,
Please, could the guest lecturer explain the reason for the choice of the theme of today's lecture, Africa in Aristotle and Aristotelian tradition?
did you get the question?
No. Somebody is asking here that why the theme of, why this topic, Africa in Aristotle and Aristotelian tradition? Why?
Why
Yes. Why did I pick this topic? Well, on the one hand, it comes from my expertise, from the skills, from the familiarity with those texts, but also, of course, I think these texts are interesting and important, to some extent because they are models of argumentation, models of scientific progress, but also to some extent that connects with the sort of more negative point with which I started, because these stand at the beginning of a long history of prejudice and discrimination, and we are still very much in the grip of many of these prejudices and many of these patterns of discrimination. And as I said, right, and also this connects with Professor Olasope's comment, these texts, the Greek and Roman texts, are not just sort of any old texts. They are foundational texts to at least European, but then also American, Anglo-American science and philosophy and political theory and so on. We all, to some extent or other, whether we like it or not, live in the house that Plato and Aristotle built. And so if we want to know how to live in that house well, sometimes we need to renovate. To some extent, we may need to tear down parts of the house. We need to know the structure of the house. Otherwise, we won't be able to live well in it.
I'll take a question from a student. Yeah. Well, he had been raising his hand. Please tell us your name, your department.
Thank you so much, ma'am. My name is Innocent Alifa from the Department of Philosophy. In sincere gratitude to Prof for exposing me to Aristotle's philosophy of geography, I was waiting to get to the point whereby racism was influenced by his theory. Because you did mention from the start that the racist tendencies across the globe are underpinned by his philosophy. But in what way can you link the racist tendencies from his theory to racist tendencies from the background of differences in skin pigmentation, like black, white, black, brown, white, brown, dichotomies? Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. So the question is, at what point does racism begin to emerge, right, out of these scientific ideas, and in particular the idea that skin pigmentation makes a big difference to people's natural aptitude, ability, and so on? My answer to that question is text 5 on the handout. If you look at text 5, that is a text in which this is Albert, connects skin color, so he speaks about the blackest Ethiopians, with physiological and intellectual characteristics. So in Albert's theory, because place determines not only how people look, but also how people are, you can then read off from people's skin color, skin pigmentation, what they are like. You can read off levels of intelligence, Albert thinks, and levels of aptitude for virtue and virtuous development from the skin tone of the person. And that is because he thinks that he has an elaborate theory that makes that persuasive, or tries to make that persuasive. There's the place where the person is, the climate of that place, and that determines not only what the person looks like, but also what the person is like in terms of intelligence and capacity for virtue. And so then the idea is, and this in the last part of the paper that I didn't have time to read out, now forms the expectations of Europeans as they first come to sub-Saharan Africa. They expect that they will be able to read off people's moral features, even the moral and intellectual characteristics of the people with the darkest skin tones. It is just and appropriate to enslave such people, they think, because they think they don't have the intellectual ability to govern themselves and to govern their own lives. And so it is better for them, these Europeans think, and they think this because of the philosophical and scientific theory that they are persuaded by, it is better for them to be enslaved by people who have the intelligence and the capacity for virtue that white people have. So this is an immediate application of the scientific framework that I've sketched that becomes overtly and depressingly racist, and that also becomes political because it serves as a justification for the enslavement practices that then took shape in the 15th century. I hope that answers the question.
Prof, please, I'd like to take two questions and then we'll end the session. Professor Kamari has been raising his hand, and Mr. Bolu, I think you can take two questions.
Thank you.
Okay, I just let me still have time, so let me take Professor Kamari's question.
Thank you very much. Maybe because of the time, I was hoping to hear what you made of all these theories. I mean, what critical conclusion you were able to draw from them. Two, one would think that from some meager evidence, geographical evidence available to Aristotle, to the Aristotelian tradition, by the time you get to Hegel and Kant, with an influence of geographical evidence, that you will have some kind of change in the theoretical understanding of the tropic and the rest.
Right.
But what you sketch for Aristotle is similar to what you find in Hegel's lecture on the history of philosophy, and the same thing in the anthropological theories of Kant. So the question for me is, how is it possible for a philosopher or philosophers to have implicit bias that they find difficult to detach themselves from? To be a child of their own time, and to also be capable of writing great books. Kant wrote the Critique of Purism, but Kant was also a sexist and racist. What made that possible?
Right. Thank you so much. Yes, so one thing you're calling attention to is the enormous influence and staying power, right? What you're calling attention to the staying power of this philosophical and scientific framework. So it starts, my story ends right in the 13th century, but as you point out, even in the 17th and 18th centuries, we find very similar ideas, allegedly scientific ideas, that in fact are racist, and racist not only about Africans, but about the place itself, Africa itself, right? Because of the idea that it's the climate of the place that then generates human beings who have these characteristics that even Hegel still ascribes to them. Right. What critical sort of lessons one can take away from that, analytical lessons, in particular about implicit bias, prejudice, even among very sophisticated and highly educated thinkers like Hegel? That's an excellent question. It's a huge question, right? One could, and in order to do justice to the question, I would have to speak for a long time. I only have a minute or so, with apologies that I'm going to give a very quick answer and sort of a bottom line slogan-like answer. I think that this theory is constructed in the context of a massive socio-economic project, which is the reorientation of the European slave trade from the north to the global south, and in particular to black Africans. So it's no coincidence that at about the same time that Albertus Magnus writes, around 1250, the first black African slaves arrive at the European slave markets. And then, of course, as we all know, right, in the context of the transatlantic slave trade, enslavement patterns of black Africans go to the New World, but also to Europe, and that becomes an industrial operation of a major size. Now, from the point of view of the Europeans, first, and then the Americans, Latin Americans who ran this operation, they needed to find ways of normalizing and naturalizing what was going on, right? This sort of systematic dehumanization of human beings needed to be normalized, needed to be, in some sense, justified because people wanted to be able to live with themselves. So that's the context in which these theories then get worked out and fine-tuned, and of course it's very important for these theories in order to have the sort of validating or normalizing role and to play it well, that they look very authoritative, that they have the sort of esteem of philosophy and science, and show that weight and authority of a scientific and philosophical theory sort of on their sleeve. And this also explains why philosophers play such an important role. They sort of fill a niche in the market. That is something that people need, that people want to read because they know what's going on, the dehumanization of whole populations of human beings, and they want that to be okay. And so philosophers satisfy that market.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'm Bulat from the Department of Religious Studies. So I hope that I'll be able to articulate my thoughts here. My question is as regards colonialism, and you said something about the global north, known for being non-intelligent and courageous, and then global south, intelligent and non-courageous. And trying to look at it in the context of what is happening now, and how geography also has an influence on our actions and our inactions too. All this you have said, how does it justify the claim for colonialism? The whites, the Europeans having to come down to Africa because it seems they came for exploration, and what they don't have, they came to get them here. And for us, for our Africans, what we have and our inability to utilize it to get the best out of it. So my question is, how does this justify for colonialism on that part and negligence on our part as Africans, and having to sit up and become courageous to resist colonialism and then make use of our resources to better our society? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. So one way of putting the question is, right, what kind of guidance can studying these scientific and philosophical theories provide for what Africans need to do now in order to resist and overcome colonialism? And in particular, the idea, right, that Africans somehow are naturally not courageous and lack certain features of character that Northern Europeans have. So I think one inspiration to take from this is that we can see so clearly and easily that these scientific theories are actually made up, and that they really don't have any kind of authority. They're not based on facts, they're not based on sort of ethnography or people going into different regions of the world objectively trying to study the behavior of different societies and structures of different societies. It's none of that. These racist theories that describe, for example, lack of courage to black Africans are not based on anthropological work. They are not based on empirical work. They are based on speculation, and they're based on satisfying certain political, ideological needs. They are really garbage. And so one should not feel under any kind of influence, one should not feel any kind of respect for these ideas. These are ideas that were constructed, given certain political and ideological needs at a particular time. We really should sort of turn away from them as much as we can and do empirical work, but also, of course, do political work, organize and agitate against sort of all the forms of colonial oppression that are still very much there. And one of the sort of organizing works is to dismantle the scientific theories that really are garbage. Even though they're very old and they look very authoritative, they are garbage. And it's, I think, important and hopefully liberating to see that.
Well, thank you so very much for your presentation and your responses to the issues raised. And as a matter of fact, your last response has to a large extent answered responded to my worries, really, because I see the Aristotelian position as far as Africa is concerned to be highly speculative and intuitive without any basis at all. And it goes to underscore the fact that it's a very risky business to try to generate knowledge from speculation and intuition. And I'm quite happy, and I think your last comment will also to that extent effectively answer what Professor Afolayan had raised earlier. That having said all, what exactly is your conclusion? Which I now understand to be that look, we shouldn't do business with this because it presents a very wrong impression or rather understanding of Africa and its people. Thank you very much.
Maybe a very, very quick response. I completely agree. But so I think I should qualify a bit what I said when I said that it's garbage. It's garbage as science. But at the same time, it was enormously influential and continues to be influential, right? Unfortunately, right. But in order to understand where we are, we need to understand that influence. We need to understand the sort of patterns, right, of the particular patterns this garbage takes. Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. What I think we should understand from this, going forward into the future, fundamentally, human beings are predatory animals. And it should really not surprise us that they are not able to cast their minds back into the past to learn the right lessons from their past so that they can make better and better informed decisions as they head into the indefinite future. Now, it's obvious to my mind that what the Europeans attempted to do, and unfortunately they succeeded brilliantly, was to hide the fact that they borrowed so much from Africans, the same way they borrowed from other parts of the world, to inform their understandings. And of course, they consider the Africans to be prime targets. They were just waiting for it, of eternal exploitation, enslavement, and so on. So that's why they still continue up to today. But my question is, what are the Africans doing? Are they liberating their minds from the tyranny of the state of nature? Are they making the right decision, the right determination, the choices they make in the way they train, cultivate, nurture, and develop what will become the nature, disposition, and character of their minds? Are they pulling their weight on the world stage? Are they being of economically productive and useful service to the other members of their species? And these are questions that we, all as Africans, need to think deeply on. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That's, of course, a very profound question. And again, I won't be able to do justice to it in just a minute or so. But I do want to say this, that the Eurocentric attitude and pattern of evaluating things that I've described sort of as evolving from Aristotle in the European tradition with these medieval thinkers at the forefront, these patterns of overvaluating European things and overvaluating European lands and climates and people and features and so on, these patterns are still with us. And I think they're also still with us in Africa, right? The sort of obsessive attention to what happens in European culture, the excessive valorization that, for example, European languages get, right? So, so there's French, there's Spanish, there's Italian. I know that hundreds of languages are spoken in Nigeria, and people don't celebrate the richness and diversity of those languages. In fact, the languages are called local languages and get sort of stigmatized and marginalized. nobody in Europe would call French a local language or Italian a local. These patterns of sort of overvaluating and valorizing all kinds of European things at the expense of African things, they come out of the kind of tradition that I've sketched. And so the hope is that to the extent that one sees how vulnerable and how ill-founded these theories are, even though they look so authoritative, they look as if they carried so much weight and deserved so much respect. Once we dismantle that picture, and once we dismantle these theories, hopefully that will open up the path to a more respectful and prouder engagement with African cultures and African heritage, even within Africa.
Thank you very much. Do we have further questions? Okay. Before then, we want to take this announcement. There's going to be a workshop tomorrow for postgraduate students on the content of classics and content of philosophy at 11 a.m. at the Faculty of Arts. We'll determine the exact venue by tomorrow. So please see you there. PG students, classics, PG students, philosophy. We'd like to have interaction with Professor Hendrik Lorenz. Okay, so I'll take one question before.
Thank you so much. So my question comprises of religion, nature, and culture. So there is a saying that says that the person that has the fiction controls the others. They will only try to make up a fiction and try to put it in the mind of other people, either by force or by philosophical teachings. So it stays, it will be the principle that will be controlling those people's lives. So my question is that, is religion really a tool of subjugation? Why I ask is that in Europe now, the percentage of Christianity, of the Christians altogether, are not up to, I don't think they are up to 24%. The Islam, the Muslims, they are only like, maybe, they are not up to 20%. So, but the people that do not really believe in religion, they are men, almost, especially in the eastern parts of Europe. Now, the second one is that nature and culture. Can we say that maybe because of the idea of maybe they trying to take themselves as superior? Like I'm talking about the Westerners, so trying to maybe they are thinking that maybe they are intellectually capable than the Africans, or more informed than the Africans. So is that why they try to divert us from? Okay, let me say it this way. So there is nature and culture. So in the nature, we know that things that are natural, our surroundings, our environment. So it is from the nature that we got the culture. So that culture is what we nourish. So can we say that, maybe, I'm so sorry, it seems to be derogatory, but I think you are a person of understanding. So, yes, I'm so sorry, I think that's how I can say it. I'm so sorry. So, can we say that maybe they think that, okay, these people will be useful, let us just try to look around and see how the nature and their culture is, so they will take the idea into their place and try to create an environment that will seems like our own nature and culture there, that will attract people to go to the place for exploitation. So the question is that is religion, yes, I was asked before, is religion really a tool of subjugation? And the question of the nature and culture. Thank you.
There's a lot there, and obviously I can't do justice to everything you said, but I do want to address one point, just one point of the various points that you made. This is about Europeans and Americans ascribing high intelligence to themselves and low intelligence to others, in part in order to justify patterns of oppression that are happening. I think that's really the sort of pattern of explanation that I at least favor. If you're looking at forms of racism, forms of bias, forms of prejudice, always ask yourself, what are the socio-economic facts? What are the facts about domination and oppression in politics and economics? And almost always you will find that the socio-economic facts beautifully explain the patterns of prejudices. Because those people who are in a position to dominate and extract and exploit are also in positions of economic power, and so they are able to tell their story and to express their perspective and to make that listened to and heard all over the place. And so if you want to justify patterns of injustice, what you're going to do is to explain this in terms of inherent features of cultures, of populations. So you're going to castigate certain cultures as inferior in comparison with other cultures, and that then normalizes and justifies and makes you feel good about patterns of asymmetric exploitation. And because the sort of dominant cultures, the cultures that are in a position to oppress and dominate, also have the reach of being able to communicate their story, this then becomes accepted or at least heard internationally. And I think sort of that's one particular way of thinking about the relationship between oppression and domination and racism. Other people think, right, that sort of racism comes first and oppression comes later. I think that's the wrong way around. I think oppression comes first, and once oppressors are in a position to oppress and get away with it, they then naturalize and normalize and justify the injustice that's going on by constructing racist theories. That's at least sort of the way of thinking about things that I found to be analytically useful and convincing. I hope that addresses to some extent your question.
Questions online?
Please, do we have any questions online? Are there any questions online? Do we have further questions? Okay, I think photograph today, members of staff. All right, members of staff, please come, let's take photograph. And then some faculty. Please come forward.